His name was John, 34 years old, sitting on a plane with his phone on airplane mode and a quiet storm waiting for him on the other side. He had no idea how many calls were stacking up, but somewhere deep inside he already knew they would come. The truth was, this was not just about a trip, and it was not just about ignoring his family for once. This was about years of silent sacrifices, about being the one who always showed up when nobody else did. As the plane cut through the clouds, John leaned back and closed his eyes, trying to enjoy the moment. But stories like his do not begin in peace. They begin long before the flight ever takes off. John had been married to his wife, Vanessa, for 7 years, and she was everything good in his life wrapped into one person. She remembered birthdays, sent thoughtful messages, and once drove through heavy rain just to comfort a coworker she barely knew. He often told her, "You are too kind for this world," and she would just smile and say, "Someone has to be." Their life together was simple, but it was built on love, patience, and quiet understanding. Still, there was one thing Vanessa had carried in her heart since childhood, a dream she never let go of. One night she whispered, "I want to see Greece one day," and that moment changed everything. From that night, John made a decision and he said, "Then we will go no matter how long it takes." They opened a small savings account and started putting money aside bit by bit, cutting back on things they did not truly need. For 2 full years they stayed disciplined, saying no to distractions, saying no to comfort, and saying yes to that dream. Every time the balance grew, Vanessa would smile like a child, and John would feel proud he could give her something she had waited so long for. By the time their anniversary approached, they had saved enough to make the trip real. It was not just money, it was time, sacrifice, and love turned into something they could finally touch. But John's life had never been only his own, because his family had always placed him second. His older sister, Sandra, had been the center of everything since they were kids, and nothing had ever changed. When she needed money, John gave it, and when she needed help, he showed up without question. His parents never asked if he was okay, they only asked what he could do for Sandra next. Even when he achieved something big, it somehow turned into a conversation about her instead. Deep down, John had learned to stay quiet, to be useful instead of seen, and to accept that love in his family came with conditions. So when the trip was finally close, John kept it quiet for as long as he could, hoping nothing would interfere this time. But during a family dinner 2 days before the flight, his mother pressed him and he finally said, "We are going to Greece." The table went silent for a second, and then Sandra laughed softly and said, "Must be nice to have money like that." His mother forced a smile, but her eyes had already changed and John felt it immediately. Vanessa squeezed his hand under the table and whispered later, "They are going to try something, you know that." John shook his head and said, "No, not this time," but even as he said it, something in his chest felt uneasy. The night before their flight, everything was finally in place, and the house felt calm in a way John was not used to. Their bags were packed neatly by the door, their outfits laid out, and their alarms set for the early morning. Vanessa checked their passports one last time and said softly, "This is really happening." John smiled and replied, "Yeah, nothing is stopping us this time." They got into bed early, knowing they had to be up before sunrise, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. But peace in John's life had a way of not lasting long, especially when his family was involved. At exactly 10:15 that night his phone started ringing. John stared at the screen and saw his mother's name flashing, and something in his stomach tightened immediately. He hesitated for a second, then answered because years of habit were hard to break. "John, listen carefully," she said, her voice already heavy with urgency. "Sandra needs you to watch the kids starting tomorrow." John sat up slowly and said, "Mom, we are leaving for Greece in a few hours." There was a pause, then she replied, "I know, but this is family and Sandra really needs you right now." Vanessa was already awake beside him, watching his face, and she did not need to hear the call to understand what was happening. John listened as his mother explained the situation, each word sounding more like a demand than a request. Sandra's husband had suddenly traveled for work, and Sandra had a commitment she could not cancel, so someone needed to stay with the kids for a full week. "You are the only one she can count on," his mother added, her tone sharpening slightly. John closed his eyes for a moment and said, "We have been planning this trip for 2 years." His mother responded quickly, "And your sister has been struggling for years too, John." The weight of guilt started creeping in, familiar and heavy, but this time something inside him resisted it. Vanessa reached for his hand, silently reminding him of everything they had worked for. Taking a deep breath, John made a choice he had never made before and he said, "I cannot cancel this trip." The silence on the other end of the phone stretched long enough to feel uncomfortable, and then his mother spoke again, but her voice had changed. "I am disappointed in you," she said coldly. "This is not how we raised you." John felt the words hit him, but he stayed steady and replied, "I am sorry you feel that way, but I am not changing my mind." She hung up without another word, and seconds later, a message from his father appeared. It read, "Family comes first, John," and John stared at it for a long moment. Vanessa leaned closer and asked gently, "What do you want to do?" John looked at her, then at the packed bags by the door and finally back at his phone. For years he had chosen his family every time, even when it cost him something important. He thought about all the times he had cancelled plans, given money and put his life on hold for Sandra. Then he thought about Vanessa, about her dream, and about the 2 years they had sacrificed to make this moment possible. Slowly he turned off his phone and placed it on the bedside table. "We are going," he said quietly, and for the first time in a long time he chose himself. They woke up at 3:30 in the morning, moving through the house in quiet excitement as if any loud noise might somehow ruin everything. Vanessa tied her hair back and smiled at John, saying, "I still can't believe we're actually doing this." He picked up their bags and replied, "We are, and nothing is stopping us now." The drive to the airport was calm, the roads nearly empty and the sky still dark. John's phone stayed off the entire time, and though part of him felt the urge to check it, he resisted. This moment belonged to them, not to anyone else. By the time they reached the airport, the weight he had carried for years already felt a little lighter. They boarded the plane just after sunrise, and as John settled into his seat, he felt something he had not felt in a long time: peace. Vanessa leaned her head on his shoulder and whispered, "Thank you for choosing us." He held her hand and said, "I should have done it sooner." As the plane lifted off the ground, it felt symbolic, like he was finally rising above years of pressure and expectations. For once there were no demands, no urgent calls, no one asking him to fix anything. There was just the sound of the engine and the promise of something new ahead. John closed his eyes and allowed himself to fully embrace the moment. After 11 hours, the plane landed, and the moment John turned his phone back on, it came alive with notifications. The screen filled instantly with missed calls, messages, and alerts, more than he could count at first glance. Vanessa looked at him and said softly, "You don't have to check it right now." But curiosity got the better of him and he opened the call log, his eyes widening. There were 43 missed calls, most of them from his mother and Sandra, and several from his father as well. His chest tightened slightly, but instead of panic he felt something else growing. It was not fear this time, it was clarity. The first voicemail was from his mother, her voice sharp and demanding as she said, "John, I need you to call me back immediately." The second was from Sandra, sounding upset as she said, "I can't believe you left, I really needed you." His father's message was short but heavy, "This is not how we raised you." John listened to them all in silence, each message carrying the same tone of disappointment and blame. Not one of them asked if he had landed safely or if he was okay. Not one of them showed concern for him as a person. Vanessa watched his expression carefully, already understanding what he was realizing. John slowly locked his phone and slipped it back into his pocket, letting out a quiet breath. Vanessa took his hand and said, "They don't miss you, John, they miss what you do for them." He looked at her, the words settling deep in his mind, and for a moment, everything became clear. All the years of helping, sacrificing, and showing up had never really been about him. It had always been about what he could provide, what he could fix, and what he could carry. He nodded slowly and said, "You're right," and for the first time he truly meant it. Together they walked out of the airport and into a new chapter of their lives. The first 2 days in Greece felt almost unreal, like they had stepped into a life that had been waiting for them all along. John and Vanessa wandered through narrow streets, stopping at small shops and quiet cafes without any plan at all. "Let's just go wherever feels right," Vanessa said, and John nodded, letting go of his usual need to control everything. They laughed more in those 2 days than they had in months, maybe even years. No one called him, no one needed him, and no one expected anything from him. It was just the two of them, exactly as it should have been all along. And slowly John began to understand what peace actually felt like. On the third day they found a small restaurant tucked away on a rooftop, overlooking the city as the sun began to set. The owner greeted them warmly and kept bringing dishes they did not even order, smiling and saying, "You try this, you will love it." Vanessa laughed as she tasted something new and said, "I think this might be my favorite place already." John watched her, taking in every detail of her happiness, and said quietly, "You deserve this." For years he had watched her put her dreams aside without complaining, always supporting him no matter what. Now seeing her like this, he knew he had made the right choice. This trip was not just a vacation, it was something they had both needed deeply. Later that evening they stood together overlooking the city as the sky turned gold and then slowly faded into deep blue. Vanessa held his arm tightly, her eyes filled with emotion, and for a while she said nothing at all. Finally she whispered, "I have dreamed about this since I was a little girl." John smiled and replied, "And now you're here." A few tears slipped down her face, not from sadness, but from a kind of joy that is hard to put into words. He wrapped his arm around her and held her close, feeling something inside him settle. In that moment there was no doubt left in his mind, he had chosen correctly. On the fourth morning, John turned his phone back on again, this time ready to face whatever was waiting for him. The messages continued where they had left off, but now they were harsher, more intense and more personal. His mother accused him of being selfish, while Sandra sent long texts about how he had abandoned her when she needed him most. His father's message was short but final, telling him not to bother coming home for the next family gathering. John read through everything slowly, but instead of feeling overwhelmed he felt strangely calm. The words no longer carried the same power over him. Something had shifted and he could not unsee it. John showed Vanessa the messages over breakfast, placing the phone on the table between them. She read each one carefully, then looked up at him and said, "This is not your responsibility anymore." He took a sip of his coffee and nodded, letting her words sink in deeper than anything his family had ever said to him. For the first time he saw the situation clearly, without guilt, without confusion, and without pressure. His family was upset because he had stopped playing a role they depended on, not because he had done something wrong. He leaned back in his chair and said, "I'm done living like that," and Vanessa smiled, knowing this was the beginning of something new. That evening, as the sun slowly disappeared into the sea, John and Vanessa sat quietly on a balcony, watching the sky change colors. The moment felt still, almost sacred, like time had decided to pause just for them. Vanessa leaned her head on his shoulder and said softly, "Thank you for choosing us." John took a deep breath and replied, "I should have done it a long time ago." For years he had been living for everyone else, putting himself last without even realizing it. But now something inside him had finally shifted. It was not anger and it was not resentment, it was clarity. From that moment on, John made a quiet decision that did not need to be announced to anyone. He was no longer going to be the one who fixed every problem, solved every crisis, or carried every burden. He would still love his family, but he would not lose himself trying to prove that love anymore. "Things are going to be different," he said to Vanessa, and she nodded like she had been waiting to hear those words. There was no need for a long speech or a dramatic declaration. The change was internal, steady, and real. And sometimes, those are the changes that last the longest. The rest of the trip unfolded exactly the way they had dreamed it would, full of laughter, exploration, and quiet moments of connection. Vanessa filled her journal every night, writing down everything she did not want to forget. John tried foods he could not even pronounce and joked, "I might not survive this trip if I keep eating like this." They walked hand in hand through beautiful streets, took photos, and created memories that felt almost unreal. For once, nothing interrupted them, no calls, no emergencies, and no guilt pulling them back. It was just life, simple and full, the way it should be. And John realized how much he had been missing without even knowing it. When they finally returned home after 2 weeks, everything looked the same, but John felt completely different. The house, the streets, the routine, nothing had changed on the outside. But inside him, there was a calm strength that had never been there before. He turned his phone on again and saw a few messages, but none of them carried the same urgency they once did. Instead of rushing to respond, he placed the phone down and unpacked their bags slowly. Vanessa smiled at him and said, "You're not in a hurry anymore," and he simply replied, "No, I'm not." Later that day, John sent a short message to the family group chat, keeping it simple and respectful. "We are back home safely, the trip was amazing, hope everyone is doing well." Hours passed before his mother finally replied, and her message was brief and distant. She said, glad you enjoyed yourself. Sandra had a difficult week. There was no welcome back, no concern and no warmth, just another reminder of how things had always been. John read the message then locked his phone without responding. For the first time in his life, silence did not feel like weakness, it felt like power. The first few weeks after they returned felt strangely quiet, like a storm had passed but the air had not fully settled yet. John was used to constant calls, constant requests and constant pressure from his family, so the silence felt unfamiliar. At first he kept checking his phone out of habit, expecting something urgent to appear. But nothing came, and slowly that tension inside him began to fade. Vanessa noticed it before he did and said, "You seem lighter." John thought about it for a moment and replied, "I think I finally stopped carrying things that were never mine." And just like that, the silence started to feel like peace instead of absence. At work, something began to change as well, something John had not expected. For years he had done his job well but had never pushed himself into the spotlight. He stayed in the background, delivered results and avoided attention, partly because he never believed he deserved more. But now, without the constant emotional drain from his family, his energy shifted. He started speaking up in meetings, sharing ideas and taking initiative in ways he had never done before. One afternoon, a colleague pulled him aside and said, "You've been holding back this whole time, haven't you?" John smiled slightly and replied, "Maybe I was." Encouraged by that realization, John began working on a project idea he had kept to himself for over a year. It was ambitious, detailed and far beyond what his company usually handled, which was exactly why he had never shared it before. Late at night, he sat at the dining table with papers spread out, sketching plans and refining every detail. Vanessa would bring him coffee and say, "Don't forget to rest," and he would laugh and reply, "Just a little more." For the first time he was investing his time into something that would grow his own life instead of fixing someone else's. And that felt different in the best possible way. After weeks of preparation, John finally presented his idea to the senior team at work. As he spoke, he felt a mix of nerves and excitement, but he stayed steady and confident. When he finished, the room went completely silent, and for a moment he wondered if he had made a mistake. Then one of the senior managers leaned forward and said, "Why haven't you brought this to us sooner?" The project was approved, and not only that, John was placed in charge of leading it. It was the biggest opportunity of his career, and it came at a time when he had finally started believing in himself. In that moment he realized how much he had been holding himself back all those years. Meanwhile, things within his family had not changed much, at least not on the surface. Through a cousin, John heard that his parents had been telling others that he had abandoned Sandra to go on a luxury vacation. The story had been twisted, making it sound like he had chosen pleasure over responsibility without any context. But what stood out the most was the truth behind it all. Sandra had eventually found someone else to watch the kids. The problem had not been impossible to solve, it had just been easier when John was available. Hearing that, he shook his head and said quietly, "It was never really about me." And for the first time that realization did not hurt, it set him free. About a month later, John received a message from his sister, Sandra, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. It was short and direct, just like always, "Mom and Dad are having a dinner next week, you should come." There was no greeting, no acknowledgement of everything that had happened, just an expectation. John stared at the message for a moment, then showed it to Vanessa. She read it and asked calmly, "Do you want to go?" He thought about it, not out of obligation this time but out of choice. After a few seconds he nodded and said, "Yes, but this time I'm going as myself." And that simple decision carried more weight than anything he had done before. A few days before the dinner, John received a call from his father, which immediately told him something serious was going on. His father was not someone who called unless it was important, and even then he kept things short. "John, we need to talk," his father said, his tone flat and direct. There was no warmth in his voice, but there was something else, something that sounded like pressure. John replied, "What is it?" and waited. What came next was not surprising, but it still hit harder than he expected. It was another problem, and once again they were coming to him. His father explained that Sandra and her husband had run into serious financial trouble. A business decision had gone wrong, and now there was a large debt threatening to create bigger problems for the family. "We need help," his father said, getting straight to the point. John listened quietly, letting the details sink in, and then asked, "What exactly are you asking from me?" There was a brief pause before his father answered, "We need money, and you are the only one who can handle it." The words were familiar, almost predictable, and that made them even heavier. For years this had been the pattern, and now it was happening again. That night, John sat with Vanessa and explained everything from the phone call to the amount of money they were asking for. She listened without interrupting, just like she always did, giving him space to think clearly. When he finished, she asked the same question she always asked: "What do you want to do?" John looked at her and said honestly, "I don't want to just give them money this time." She nodded and replied, "Then don't, unless it makes sense for you, not for them." There was no pressure in her voice, no expectation, just support. And that gave John the clarity he needed to think differently about the situation. Instead of reacting immediately, John did something he had never done before. He stepped back and thought carefully. He reached out to a financial advisor and explained the entire situation, including the family history behind it. After listening, the advisor leaned forward and said, "You can help, but it needs to be structured, not emotional." That one sentence stayed with John long after the meeting ended. For the first time, he realized that helping did not have to mean sacrificing himself completely. There could be boundaries, there could be conditions, and there could be accountability. And with that understanding, John began preparing a different kind of response. Over the next 2 days, John worked carefully on what he planned to present to his family, treating it with the same seriousness as a professional project. He drafted clear terms, outlining that any money he gave would be a loan, not a gift, and that it would be repaid over time. He added conditions about responsibility, including that Sandra and her husband would take ownership of the debt, not his parents. Vanessa looked over the document and smiled, saying, "This is the strongest version of you I have ever seen." John nodded and replied, "I just wish I had done this sooner." It was not about being harsh, it was about being fair to them and to himself. And for the first time, helping did not feel like losing. When the day of the dinner arrived, John walked into his parents' house with a calm confidence he had never carried before. The familiar smell of food filled the air, and Sandra was already seated with her husband, both looking tense. His parents greeted him, but the atmosphere felt cautious, like everyone knew something important was about to happen. They sat down and began eating, making small talk as if nothing had changed. John allowed it for a while, listening quietly, waiting for the right moment. Then, as the conversation slowed, he placed the folder gently on the table. "We need to talk about the situation you mentioned," he said, his voice steady. The room fell silent as John opened the folder and began explaining his proposal clearly and calmly. He went through each point: the loan structure, the repayment plan, and the conditions that came with it. Sandra's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief as she said, "You want us to sign an agreement?" John met her eyes and replied, "Yes, because this is serious and it needs to be treated that way." Her husband looked uncomfortable but listened, while his parents remained quiet, taking in every word. This was not the version of John they were used to, and it showed. For the first time, he was not reacting, he was leading. At first, Sandra resisted, her voice rising as she said, "This is not how family should act." John did not raise his voice, he simply replied, "Family should not take advantage of each other either." The words landed heavily and the room grew even quieter. His father leaned forward and began reading through the document carefully, while his mother watched with a thoughtful expression. After a few moments, his father looked up and said, "This makes sense." That single sentence shifted the entire room, and Sandra slowly sat back down, realizing things were no longer going to be the same. The old patterns had been broken and there was no going back. By the end of the night, something unexpected happened. The tension began to turn into understanding. Sandra's husband agreed to the terms, admitting quietly that things needed to change, and Sandra, though reluctant at first, finally accepted it. His parents acknowledged that they had relied on John too heavily over the years, something they had never openly said before. It was not perfect and it was not easy, but it was honest, and that made all the difference. As John stood to leave, his mother hugged him in a way she never had before, real and sincere. Driving home, Vanessa smiled and said, "You didn't just help them, you changed everything." John looked ahead and replied, "No, I just stopped losing myself," and for the first time in his life he truly felt whole.